A cold wind whispered through the stone corridors of the Château de Chinon, carrying the scent of damp parchment and smoldering hearths. The walls exhaled centuries. Outside, banners sagged with the weight of frost, bearing the fleur-de-lis faded, frayed, yet defiant against the pale morning. Somewhere between silence and smoke, history held its breath. In a dim chamber lit by dying firelight, a boy stood barefoot upon flagstones colder than betrayal. He was not yet 13, but his eyes had aged past war. Before him, a map trembled under the weight of spilled wine and bloodlines drawn and redrawn, a nation split like rotted timber. France did not bleed clean, it oozed memory and spite. This was not how wars were meant to begin. There was no trumpet blast, no duel at dawn, only silence, turned sour. The death of Charles IV had not been a death knell but a door creaking open. Into that void stepped claims like shadows each longer than the last. The English king, Edward III, raised his mother's bloodline like a sword, claiming a crown across a sea. France recoiled, spat, and hardened. But the truth was buried beneath banners and birthrights. This was not a war of parchment. It was a war of memory, of soil, of firelight in peasant cottages that no longer stood. The priests argued in their Latin tongues about divine right, each word curling like incense, rising to rafters God no longer listened from. Nobles met beneath tapestries of lion and lily, muttering oaths as hollow as their goblets. They drew lines not in ink, but in grain, in salt, in the marrow of their people. While they debated, a village in the south buried its last son in frost-hardened earth, the mother too tired to weep. No chronicler came for them, no knight rode to their defense. Their grief was a shadow cast on fields no longer sown. By the hearth, the boy king whispered not to his advisers, but to the flickering silhouettes, the fire painted on the walls, shadows that danced like ghosts of kings past men who bled to keep this land whole, or at least called it theirs as it shattered. He had no sword yet, but he had something sharper, hunger. I will take it back, he said, not as a prince, but as a promise. The war had stretched into its third decade, a beast too old to remember its first wound, but too proud to lie down and die. Men no longer fought for crowns, they fought for ghosts, for what their fathers could not hold, for what their sons might forget. It was pride, wrapped in steel. At Crécy, the arrows had fallen like hail English longbows screaming death across the sky. Men died without ever seeing their enemy's face, their last sight, the gray above them turning black. At Poitiers, a king had been taken, not slain, and France had gasped, not in pain, but in disbelief. Now the war had come home again, not in battle, but in doubt. Doubt in the throne, doubt in the boy. They whispered he was too young, too frail, too easily led by nobles fattened on fear, but the boy heard them, even in silence. And silence, in castles, was louder than drums. Outside, frost clawed at the stained glass like time itself. Each pane told stories of saints and sinners, but the glass did not warm. The boy placed his palm against it, watching breath fog the edges. What is a king without a crown? What is a crown without belief? He closed his eyes, and saw not banners or battles, but mothers pulling frozen bread from hollow ovens. Fields left fallow because the sons who would till them had been taken for some lord's levy. Daughters married to settle debts written in ink, while the grooms drank themselves to forget. This was not a war of glory, it was a slow bleeding, a sickness. In the hall below torches crackled as nobles waited. Their voices echoed faintly, laughter masking fear. The boy knew they did not serve him. They served themselves, draped in titles and silk. But still they needed a symbol, a center to orbit, a shadow to cast blame upon when the harvests failed and the coffers emptied. He would be that shadow, if he must. But not quietly. He turned back to the map. Each red stroke marked a village lost, each blot of wine, a border disputed. But it wasn't the lines that mattered, it was what lay between them, the breath of people, the stories, the soil. He lifted a piece of charcoal, fingers trembling not with fear, but with fire, and drew a line where no line should go, across enemy lands, across shame, across retreat. A line not of division, but of return. A servant entered, timid. "Your Grace, the council waits." The boy did not turn. "Let them wait." The servant paused, uncertain. "Shall I fetch the crown?" He looked down at his feet, bare and pale against the stone, then at the charcoal smeared across his skin, a war paint not yet washed. Finally, he met the servant's eyes. "No," he said. "Let them see me like this." He walked barefoot into the hall of wolves. The nobles rose, surprised not by his presence, but by the fire in his silence. He did not sit, he did not speak, he only looked, one by one, at the faces of men who had gambled his future like dice on a tavern table. They flinched first, and in that moment, the boy became more than a symbol, he became memory, defiant and quiet. Outside, the frost began to melt, because spring had come, but because war was waking again, not in armor, but in intention. The boy had made no decree, he had sent no rider, but the air shifted. In the dungeons beneath China, a prisoner hummed a song no one remembered. In a convent on the Loire, a girl stitched a banner with hands blistered from winter. And in the forests of Limousin, a knight without a master looked east, toward the land he had once sworn to protect. Something had begun, not with a scream, but with a whisper, not with blood, but with belief. And as the candle in the map chamber died, its smoke curled like a crown unclaimed. The war was no longer about who had the stronger army, it was about who could endure the silence, who could hold memory longer, who could suffer, and still walk barefoot into a room that wanted him broken. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a shadow stirred a voice neither English nor French, but something older, something hungry. For the war would not end with this boy, it would pass through him, like fire through a forest, leaving roots smoldering for generations. And the next chapter would begin, not in a castle, but in a convent, where a young girl dreamed of swords and saints. The church bells of Rouen rang out a dirge beneath a gray sky thick with smoke and incense. Inside the cathedral, the scent of damp stone and candle wax clung to the air like regret. Each echo of the bells seemed to chip away at hope, as if heaven itself had grown weary. Soldiers knelt alongside peasants, armor clinking beside threadbare wool. No prayer passed their lips, only silence, only breath. Beyond the heavy doors, carts creaked through mud and blood, pulled by trembling oxen and steered by hands too young or too old for war. Upon the planks, the wounded lay, eyes unblinking, limbs splintered, souls dangling between this life and another. It was 1356, and France no longer bled from its borders, it bled from within. The war, once a bannered chess match between nobles, had sunk its claws into the marrow of the land. It had begun to take the shape of God, carving his image into every shattered church and every plague-ravaged town. At the back of the cathedral, beneath a cracked stained glass window, sat a young scribe. His fingers were stained black with ink, his shoulders hunched like a man thrice his age. Before him, a scroll stretched out a river of names, curling and smudged. Some he could barely spell, their owners never known to court nor chronicle. Jehan de Lepi, Mark the pig boy, Pierre of the mill, farmers turned footmen, sons turned corpses, their blood as red as any noble's, yet none would be remembered beyond this parchment. He paused as he dipped his quill, gaze flicking up to the altar. A statue of the Virgin stared back through cracked marble eyes. Did she weep for them, or had the heavens closed their gaze long ago? On that day, far south in the fields of Poitiers, the English had captured the French king himself. The battle, a chaos of iron and dust, had ended in humiliation. King John, draped in gold and pride, had been dragged from his destrier and taken across the Channel not as monarch, but as prize. Yet even as England celebrated, the streets of Rouen drowned in cries, not for the king, but for the boys who would not return, for the daughters who would never wed, for the mothers with nothing left but soil and silence. The scribe scribbled another name, the ink running thin. A cough echoed through the nave, then another, then a rattle low and hollow. It came not from the sick, but from memory, from the plague, whose shadow had not fully left. The black death had swept through just years before, a reaping wind that spared no hearth. Its scent still lingered in corners, in the spaces between prayers, and where it passed, famine had followed, then war. It was as if France had fallen into a spiral, holy, bloody, unrelenting. Outside, a priest murmured to a gathering crowd. His voice trembled not with age, but with doubt. "Is this God's punishment?" he asked aloud, as if seeking an answer from the wind. "Or has he abandoned us altogether?" The people did not answer. Their eyes were hollow, not from lack of faith, but from exhaustion. Faith demanded strength, and France had little left to give. Yet amid the ruin, something began to stir, not in courts or battlefields, but in grain fields and cloisters, in taverns and marketplaces. The tremor of resistance, soft, almost imperceptible, crept beneath the ash. Priests who once praised divine right now whispered of injustice. Tithes went unpaid. Merchants closed their shutters to taxmen and opened them to outlaws. And in a village yet untouched by fire, a young girl named Jane spoke of visions, of voices, of liberation. No one yet listened, but the wind had changed. The scribe, now finished with his roll, gently laid his quill aside. He did not pray. Instead, he walked to the cathedral doors, pushing them open to the cold gray world. The sky hung heavy with smoke, not from battle, but from hearths lit too early in the day, as if night had swallowed the sun. Ash drifted like snow, settling on the shoulders of the grieving, and yet in the market square, a child laughed, just once, then silence again. The scribe watched the carts roll past, watched as a soldier, missing his right hand, tried to lift a pail with the left, watched as a nun gently closed the eyes of a boy no older than 10. He had no words, only witnessing. In his chest, a hollow ache, not quite grief, not quite anger, something deeper, the kind of ache that comes when meaning begins to decay, when the stories you were told crumble in your hands. The king was gone. The army shattered. The church divided. What then was sacred? Behind him, the bells stopped ringing. The silence that followed was not peace, it was waiting. A silence that stretched between breaths, between centuries, as if time itself paused, uncertain whether to mourn or rebel. And in that pause, something took root, not a trumpet, not a crown, not even a sword, a whisper, a question, a vision murmured by a peasant girl in Domremy, a priest tearing a page from the Book of Kings, a merchant refusing to kneel. The war would continue, men would die, cities would burn, but belief, true belief, had begun to shift, no longer chained to thrones or mitres, no longer bound to gold or genealogy. It would rise, slowly, through the cracks, from ink-stained fingers, from forgotten names, and when it did, the kingdom would not recognize itself. The scribe returned to his desk, and added one final line beneath the list of the dead, a blank line. For the living yet to rise, for the story not yet written, for the rebellion beneath the ash. And somewhere beyond ruin, across fields bruised by frost, the snow began to fall, quiet, indifferent, pure. It did not stop the war, but it softened the ground, so that something new might one day grow. The snow had fallen all night, quiet, uninvited, thick as wool, and by dawn, the battlefield near Agincourt lay mute beneath its shroud. No trumpets now, no cries of charge or mercy, just the hush of death settling over churned earth. Mud, once screamed over by horse and man, now drank the silence like wine. A raven circled once, then vanished into the pewter sky. An arrow, lodged deep in the throat of a boy, not yet 17, jutted like a crooked feather from a broken quill. His lips parted, not in pain, but wonder. As if in the last beat of his young heart, he was still waiting for someone, his mother, perhaps, to pull him from this cruel waking. Around him, others lay like scattered dolls, some armored, some barefoot, all equal beneath the snow's quiet judgment. Beyond the carnage, King Henry stood, still as a relic, his steel helm cast a long shadow, but not longer than the silence within him. The Book of Hours bound to his saddle hung heavy with frost. His gaze roamed not the fallen, but the heavens, as if awaiting some celestial applause. But the sky offered no song, only the cold breath of a god too tired to speak. To Henry, this was not victory, it was scripture, every drop of blood a verse, every corpse a sacrifice. He whispered Latin beneath his breath, not to mourn the dead, but to sanctify them. This ground, this foreign soil, was now England's altar, and on it, the flower of French nobility had been laid bare. But prophecy comes in many tongues. A league away, within the hushed ruins of a convent once devoted to Saint Cecilia, Sister Elodie pressed cloth to the hand of a trembling boy. His fingers were blood-slick and clenched, as if refusing to remember what they'd done. She did not ask his name. Names were luxuries in war. Instead, she wiped each knuckle, each nail, each trembling joint, whispering hymns no longer meant for saints. The boy's eyes brimmed with something worse than pain. Guilt. "I didn't mean to," he choked. "He had the same crest as my father, the lion, red on gold. We used to stamp wax with it." Elodie paused. In the flickering light of the convent's single unbroken window, she saw not a soldier, but a sun unraveling. "There are no crests in hell," she murmured. Outside, wind howled through broken stone, rattling loose a statue of the Virgin. Her marble face cracked, and from her eye, a shard of ice slipped like a tear. Back in Paris, the court reeked not of death, but perfume and ink. Yet the rot was just as thick. Within the great hall of the Palais de la Cité, voices rose like wolves in winter. Burgundians banged goblets against oak. Armagnacs spat oaths from behind velvet sleeves. The Dauphin sat pale and idle, fingers twitching beneath rings that meant nothing now. France was not a nation, but a corpse, still warm enough for vultures to fight over. Beneath these quarrels, letters moved like veins beneath the skin, carried by boys with quick legs and terrified eyes. Love letters, sealed with wax and hope, orders signed in blood, coded scrolls for English eyes. Each candlelit page another thread in the noose tightening around the realm. A widow wrote to her husband's cousin in the south. "They say the English pray before battle, and that's why they win. Should I teach the children to kneel before bread?" A priest wrote to Rome, "There is no France, only ash and pride." A spy wrote to no one, "The king bleeds prophecy." But prophecy is silent now. The nun lit her last candle that night. Its flame shivered in the draught, casting golden shadows across her face. "How long must we suffer?" she whispered, voice no louder than snow, but the Virgin gave no answer. Only the drip of wax upon stone, like a clock running out of time. In the fields, beneath willow and frost, the horses twitched in their final dreams. Some still stood, tethered and wild-eyed, hooves shifting uneasily in blood-drenched mud. They did not understand the silence. They waited for masters who would never call again, and the crows they had returned. They hopped over limbs and opened eyes, peering in, plucking what memory remained. Unmoved by loyalty, or flags, loyal only to hunger. One crow perched on a broken lance, its tip sunk deep into a noble's spine. The man's velvet surcoat had once caught candlelight at court. Now it was tattered, a rag around bone. His signet ring gleamed even now stubborn in death. From the woods came the soft jangle of armor. A squire, perhaps, searching for his lord. Or a scavenger, dagger in hand, looking for gold teeth or warm cloaks. No one called out. No one challenged. The war was still speaking, even if the men no longer did. Henry returned to his tent before dusk. The air inside was warm from bodies and breath. Clerics chanted thanksgiving in hushed Latin, their voices winding like incense. But Henry did not join them. He sat alone by the brazier, fingers tight around his sword's pommel. He did not weep. Kings do not weep. But he watched the flames dance, and in them saw not fire, but faces. The boy archer from Yorkshire, who had laughed in camp, and now lay face down in mire. The knight who had begged forgiveness in French, only to be silenced mid-prayer. The messenger who had warned him of the trap at the marsh. Too late. These were the faces of victory. He looked away. Outside, the snow thickened. A world whitening itself clean, but blood runs deep beneath snow, and far to the south, as bells rang in Chartres, and wolves howled beyond the Rhone, a girl touched her belly, and whispered a name not yet born. Her husband, lost to Agincourt, would never know. But the child would, and someday perhaps, the snow would fall again. Not as a burial, but as a promise. A silence before rebirth. A pause before the next cry. The wax had pooled into a small, cold halo at the edge of the table, forgotten. Like so many hopes in the dark hours of Orléans, the rat scurried across the flagstone, unchallenged. The air stank of iron and mildew, cloaked in the breath of too many fearful souls. Night no longer fell, it crouched, waiting, and then, the sound. Not cannon, not boots, but hooves, deliberate, echoing, defiant, as if the very stones were being commanded to wake. She entered not as a savior, but as an interruption to despair. Beneath armor too bright for this soiled world, with a banner white as bone and fire stitched into its edges, she rode. The people did not cheer, not at first. They watched, silent, wondering if hunger had conjured her, if grief had stitched this girl from dreams. Her name passed mouth to mouth like contraband. Jeanne, Joan, Maid of God, a name too clean for war, yet too dangerous for peace. She dismounted not like a knight, but like a revelation. Her eyes held no fear, only urgency. Inside the cathedral, where even saints had grown quiet, she knelt on stone older than kings, and prayed not for mercy, but for movement. She asked the silence to listen, and the silence answered. The general's map bore her gaze like a wound. She pointed where no man dared, at bastions soaked in failure. There, she said, we begin where hope has died longest. The war council scoffed at first. Her words were untrained, her tactics foreign. But her certainty, it was elemental. Like fire, you do not argue with fire. You either flee it, or you follow it. They followed. In the alleys, children who had forgotten laughter now whispered her name to the rats. Soldiers drank less, prayed more. The smell of rusting steel gave way, faintly, to smoke and oil, the scent of weapons sharpened for purpose, not survival. Even the sky seemed to hesitate, as if watching. Across the river, the English stirred. They saw her banner and did not laugh. Superstition is not owned by the poor. Their commanders ordered prayers not out of mockery, but fear. For war is a place where symbols matter more than swords. The first skirmish came like a test. Joan, clad in silver that caught every flame, led from the front. Her sword was not stained, not yet, but it rang against steel like a psalm. Behind her, the weary found rhythm. The French moved like men possessed not by madness, but by meaning. They did not fight better. They fought differently, as if losing was no longer a language they spoke. She was wounded, an arrow to the shoulder. Blood soaked her sleeve, bright against the dull of war. They begged her to fall back. She refused. Do not fear for me, she said. I was born for this. And she pressed forward, eyes alight, dragging hope behind her like a standard. Orléans watched from rooftops and rubble as the impossible began. Bastions fell. Not all, not yet, but enough to make the bells ring again. Enough to make the priests weep openly, hands trembling over fire-lit altars. The city did not rejoice. Rejoicing is for after. What they felt was closer to breath after drowning. In the houses where food was scarce, loaves appeared. Where wounds festered, they were bound. She did not heal the city, but she reminded it of what healing might feel like. Yet behind the rain-washed banners and holy songs, something darker grew. Whispers, not from the English, but from within. A girl who speaks to saints is only a miracle, until she threatens power. Then she becomes something else, a weapon, or worse, a question. The clergy debated her in hushed Latin. Was she chosen, or possessed? Could God speak through a peasant girl in trousers and steel? Could holiness bear the face of someone without noble blood? And what if she failed? No man feared God's silence. They feared his betrayal, that he might speak through the wrong mouth. The king's men watched her rise and wondered if she might eclipse the crown, for France had not seen such belief in decades, and belief, when not managed, becomes dangerous. It burns structure, it mocks protocol, it leaps. But she paid no heed to court or canon. She moved with urgency, as if time itself had limits. She wrote letters to her enemies, calling them to surrender, in the name of heaven. Some laughed, others trembled, for in every war, there comes a moment when the ghost of peace becomes more terrifying than the sword. One evening, as rain fell soft and uncertain, Joan stood alone on the ramparts. Below, the lore whispered secrets in the dark. Above, clouds shifted like wounded animals. A priest approached her cautiously, reverently. "Do you believe God truly chose you?" he asked, eyes searching. She did not turn. "No," she said. "I know he did." And in that knowing, the world tilted. The next day the city surged again. This time, not just with her, but because of her. The people, the starving, the wounded, the forgotten, moved as one. They carried stones, raised timbers, sharpened stakes, not because they believed in France, but because they believed in something, in someone. And for the first time, the siege faltered. Not ended, not broken, but wounded. The English stared across their trenches and saw not a starving mob, but a people resurrected by faith, by fire, by a girl who should have been a myth, and instead was flesh. In the black hours before dawn, when even courage feels cold, Orléans no longer prayed for deliverance, it prepared for it. And somewhere, in the shadows behind velvet and vestments, hands began to move, not in prayer, but in plans. For miracles, when ungoverned, must be managed, or removed. But for now, the bells rang, high, wild, free. Joan stood in the tower, wind whipping her banner like prophecy. Below her, 1,000 voices cried out, not in despair, but in devotion. And though the war had not ended, and would not for years to come, something irreversible had begun. Not victory, not yet, but revolution. And sometimes, revolution is born not of fire or steel, but of one clear voice saying, "We begin." The candlelight in Westminster flickered like the last breaths of a dying prayer. Stone walls, soaked in centuries of whispers, leaned inward as if listening again. A hush fell over the chamber. The guards shifted, the air thickened, not with perfume, but with prophecy. A footstep echoed. Then another. Ink-stained shoes creaked against the polished floor, and there she stood, Margaret of Anjou, barely 15, yet draped in velvet, the color of morning wine. Her eyes scanned the room, not with fear, but with calculation. Behind her, the Thames murmured against its banks, swollen with spring tawas, if nature itself had something to confess. She moved as though already crowned, though the coronation lay weeks ahead. Her veil trailed behind, like mist from another land, and the courtiers whispered behind fans and goblets. "French," they muttered. "French tongue, French queen," as if peace could wear foreign silk without shedding English bone. They had expected a girl. They received a shadowed flame. Her marriage to Henry VI was meant to mend the rift, a royal thread to stitch the gaping wound of war. But the needle passed through flesh, long dead. The peace was brittle. France was bleeding. England was hungry, and in that hunger, Margaret stepped into a kingdom of suspicion. Henry, her husband, gentle as milk, pale as linen, sat, like a ghost beside her. His gaze rarely held hers. His prayers rose more often than his voice. A king of mercy in an age that demanded steel. His kindness unnerved her. She had seen wolves in Lorraine wear softer eyes before they devoured lamb. The people, those bruised by battles they never chose, watched her with clenched jaws. In alehouses and bakeries, their grief boiled beneath crust and froth. They remembered Crécy, where arrows fell like hail. They remembered Agincourt, where sons vanished into mud and glory. And now this queen from across the sea, was she here to finish what France had started? Yet Margaret did not flinch. She walked among the tapestries and daggers with a spine made not of courtly grace, but of tempered will. She had seen queens claw power through childbirth, betrayal, and blood. She would carve her place, not as a consort, but as a cornerstone. And where Henry was hesitant, she would harden. If the king would not roar, she would. She began to write, not treaties, not poems, but letters. Webs of ink spun through Europe, catching noblemen and whispers alike. Her language was silk wrapped around steel. She did not ask. She did not beg. She reminded. Every alliance was a chess piece moved beneath candlelight. Every favor called was a dagger sheathed in velvet. The ink dried quickly in her chamber, but the consequences bled slow into the soil of England. In time, she gathered not soldiers, but loyalty, not armies, but belief. Men who once scoffed at her now watched her with narrowed respect, unsure whether they feared or admired her. She had no army at first, but she had resolve, and resolve could split kingdoms more surely than steel. She never shouted. Her silence was her spear. At night she stood by the window overlooking the river. The Thames, fat with melted snow, crawled past like time itself, dragging secrets, corpses, and letters alike. Sometimes she whispered to it. Sometimes she simply listened. She knew that England could not live forever in the shadow of a paper peace. That war, once awakened, does not sleep again until it has fed. Henry dreamt of saints, Margaret dreamt of storms, and outside the court, the people did not care for saints. They were tired of rot beneath royal tapestries, tired of promises spoken in Latin, while their children starved in Saxon. They wanted justice, or revenge, or simply a reason to keep sharpening their blades. Margaret gave them none, not yet, but she watched, and waited. In her silence, Parliament shifted. Lords felt the gravity of her presence, though her crown still gleamed with borrowed gold. The whispers grew, that she ruled in all but name, that she whispered to the king and the wind obeyed. She did not deny it, and yet she did not love war. Not the way some men did, as sport or inheritance. She had seen the eyes of widows too often to romanticize the sword, but she understood power. She understood that sometimes, peace is the lie that power tells before it takes. So she waited. Her hands, soft as a duchess's, wrote with the rhythm of a general. And when the letters stopped, the marching would begin. She was not Joan. She bore no visions of saints or flames. She was not a monk, cloaked in ink and duty. She was not made to beg. She was made to reign. The court would not name her commander. The church would not call her pure. But history would remember her scorned by some, revered by others as the furnace that kept the war from cooling. She wore loyalty like a cloak, and betrayal like a blade, tucked near her ribs. And as her chamber fell into quiet, that spring night, she stood at her window once more. The moon shimmered on the river. Somewhere, a church bell rang, hollow and distant. She did not turn, she simply whispered to no one, or perhaps to history. The war is not over. It has simply changed its face. Beneath her, the river moved, and in the hills beyond the palace, a farmer's son tightened the straps of his boots. A priest fumbled a sermon he no longer believed. A nobleman burned a letter unread, and a queen half girl, half legend began to shape a storm. What was once a king's burden was now hers, and in the distance, far from the candlelight of Westminster, a different sound stirred, hooves on mud, steel on whetstone. The future, it seemed, had begun to ride. The monastery in Picardy had no voice. Its bell tower stood like a blind sentinel, rusted tongues frozen in silence. Wind rattled through the cloister arches like a memory trying to find its way home. In the scriptorium, the last flickers of a dying candle bent shadows across parchment. An old monk, draped in a robe more patch than cloth, leaned over a wooden desk scored with the scratches of generations. His hand trembled, not with age, but with knowing. Beneath the ochre light, the final line awaited, and thus ended the 100 Years' War. But his quill did not move. He listened instead to the creak of wooden beams above, to the hush of forgotten hymns nestled between the stones. Outside, fields once soaked in blood now wore a shroud of green. Forests had reclaimed the dead. Villages once taken, burned, rebuilt, and lost again, now lay still, as if holding their breath. They said the war was over, but he knew better. He had seen too much. Boys turned to soldiers with mud-caked eyes and hollow laughter. Men who had kissed wives goodbye with lips already tasting death. Ghosts that marched long after their flesh had gone. He had held dying hands that clutched holy relics and foreign coins with equal desperation. He had buried not only scrolls beneath flagstones to protect them from the flames but names, faces, sins, and saints. His fingers hovered above the parchment. He was the last voice in a line of chroniclers who had written by candlelight, while walls trembled with cannon thunder. His teacher's teacher had begun the record when kings still rode into battle in plate and pride. Now kings lay beneath stone effigies, and their legacies bled into earth and ink. He had written the battles, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, not as strategy, but as human ache. The archers with blisters who cried for their mothers. The knights who fell into ditches, drowning in their own armor. The priests who crossed themselves before looting the dead. And yet, he could not end it. Because it had not ended. In Calais, England still clung to its final foothold, like a wound refusing to close. Smoke still curled from watchtowers, and resentment flickered like embers. In Gascony, merchants cursed empty docks and broken oaths. The vines grew wild, but the barrels remained dry. Even in the wind, there was no peace. It carried voices still Latin prayers swallowed by cannon fire, French cries of vengeance, English vows murmured into death. He stood. The parchment lay behind him, unfinished. He stepped into the corridor, the soles of his sandals whispering across stone. Every corridor here remembered something, whispers of lost brothers, footsteps of soldiers who had entered under truce and left with bloodied blades. He reached the chapel, its doors groaned open like a tired confession. Inside, the crucifix waited, ancient, splintered, still. He lit a single candle. The flame shivered, shadows leapt across the chapel wall, long and bowed, as if soldiers knelt once more. The monk watched the light dance, and for a moment, it looked like memory had taken shape. He did not pray, not aloud. Instead he remembered. He remembered the child left at the cloister gate, wrapped in a soldier's cloak. He remembered the queen who wept not for her lost sons, but for the peasants who bore their swords. He remembered the knight who rode to war with psalms on his tongue and murder in his hands. And he remembered the silence that followed each battle, not the peace of resolution, but the silence of exhaustion, of nothing left to say. He knelt, not before God, but before history. Because who else would remember, if not him? Outside, the sky paled. Dawn crept across the stones like a hesitant guest. The graveyard behind the chapel, once ordered and noble, had grown wild. Stones sank, names faded, but the dead remained, kings and queens, saints and heretics, farmers and scribes, all of them buried in the same dirt, all of them conqueror and conquered, now equal in the judgment of time. A thrush sang, the first song of morning. But beneath that melody, the monk still heard drums. England, far from done, would tear itself apart in the years to come. The red rose and the white would bloom with blood. France would attempt to rebuild, but its wounds were deep, its villages hollowed, its fields salted, its people broken in ways no parchment could contain. The war had ended in treaties, but not in men, not in the dreams passed from father to son, not in the eyes of a widow watching her child play with a wooden sword. The war had moved from battlefields into hearts. The monk rose slowly, his knees stiff with age and prayer. He turned, letting the candle burn on. One day, someone would lift the flagstone beneath which he had buried the scrolls. Someone would find the ink, faded, but not silent, and perhaps then, they would understand, the past is not past. It waits in ink, in ruins, in names carved into trees and sung in lullabies. He walked back to the scriptorium. The ink had dried in his quill, but now, he dipped it once more. Not to end the story, but to mark its turning. He added a final linnet of conclusion, but of warning. And from these ashes, new fires shall rise, because he knew history does not sleep. It only changes shape, and somewhere beyond Picardy, beyond the hills and the hollows, the future was already gathering with its own swords, its own songs and its own wars yet to name.